Hello, fellow cyborgs, and welcome to my review of Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. I recently read this during the month of October, and more importantly, Victober. This is my new favorite Dickens novel, which is tied with A Christmas Carol as far as star ratings, but I think I enjoyed this a lot more than I enjoyed reading A Christmas Carol. Before I get into reasons why this is so excellent, I will tell you the book haiku. There's nothing better than Dickens writing about some kick-ass women. Dombey and Son is a quite big Dickens, which means you've got a huge cast of characters, over a dozen, that come up and recede and come back up within this novel, but the main storyline has to do with the Dombey family. Mr. Dombey has recently, in the first chapter, been given a son by his wife, and he is a very well-to-do businessman, and he has a company called Dombey and Son. He has a 6-year-old daughter named Florence, but his business is called Dombey and Son, and it is very, very important that he gets that son. In the opening page, as I said, he does finally get his son, and then soon after loses his wife to complications with the pregnancy, and so he's left alone with an unwanted eldest daughter and a brand newborn son. Another family group that you get to learn of fairly early in the novel is Solomon Gills, his nephew Walter, and Solomon's friend Captain Cuddle. Solomon runs this shop of seafaring naval sorts of instruments, and it's not doing very well. Captain Cuddle is an old Navy seaman. Walter, who starts out the book quite young, probably at the age 14, something like that. He really wants to go to sea, but Solomon Gills, his uncle, knows how dangerous that can be and is really trying to get Walter out of the romance of a Navy life, or just a seaman life. I don't think they're actually in the military. Fairly early on in the novel, these two families intersect, and then you get to see the aftermath and as they grow apart and come back together, etc., etc. So the joy in this book, as you may have heard from Katie from Books and Things, who is the entire reason that I decided I wanted to read Dombey and Son. I will link her review of Dombey and Son down below. So the entire reason that this book is so great is that this is delving into gender issues in the Victorian society. Now, one of the things that I struggle with Charles Dickens is that oftentimes his works have to do with political issues of the day. So for instance, in Little Dorrit, it's talking about debtors' prisons and also respectability. In Our Mutual Friend, it's also talking about money and respectability and how that all intersects. A Tale of Two Cities is a historical novel surrounding the French Revolution. So these are big topics that I do not know very much about. I am a psychology major, or I was in university, and so people are something that I really understand. And this book is really all about people and how they come together in different sorts of social institutions, whether it's friendship, family, marriage, etc. The really cool thing about Dombey and Son is its portrayal of women, from the nursery maid that the son Dombey has from an infant, up to a very interesting woman in the character of Edith that you meet about halfway through the book. The only woman in this novel who isn't doing something really interesting with her gender role is Florence Dombey, the main girl. She's a kind of angel character, very, very similar to Little Dorrit in Little Dorrit. She's definitely not as complex as some of the other women characters. She isn't as feminist or proto-feminist as some of the other characters in here, but I mean, she doesn't kill the book. Like, she's a lovely person. You can't really hate her. Maybe at worst you'll find her annoying, but at best you'll just say, okay, well, you know, Dickens had to have one example of very traditional womanhood in Victorian society, so he gave us Florence, and it's fine. So in here you have instances of servant women standing up to their male bosses. There's this one really beautiful scene where a character compares a woman's role on the marriage market to prostitution. There are these two sets of mother-daughter relationships that foil one another that are really, really interesting to look at. And on top of that, there are a great many really fun male characters as well. well. Toots is one of my favorites. He's a school friend of Paul, the little Dombey, and falls in love with Florence at a very early age. Walter is an absolute gem, kind of reminds me of John Chivery in Little Dorrit, and Captain Cuddle is perhaps the most lovable salty seaman I have ever read about. There is also a really interesting villain, if you could call him a villain. He's as close to the antagonist of the book as you're going to get, but he's really just subtle in how that works and how he interacts with the different characters. And it took me a long time to figure out that he was the bad guy, but it was nothing as an exaggerated sort of sense as Blandois in Little Dorrit, let's say. So there was just so much in this book that I'm sure I missed out when I was first reading it. I listened to the David Timpson audiobook, which I highly, highly recommend. I loved his narration so much, but I'm definitely looking forward in the future to either reading along while he reads it or just to read it myself and get to delve into those details that I didn't pick up the first time. So if you are going to pick up any of the huge tomes of Charles Dickens, I highly, highly recommend that you give Dombey and Son a real consideration. This was not that complicated of a plot, and some of his plots can get very complicated. There are so many characters to love. In Little Dorrit, I found that there was a huge cast of characters, but there were only like less than 4 that I really cared about. And so when we were following those other characters, I was just bored to death. But here, even if I didn't like all of the characters, I found them all entertaining and interesting. So there was never a dull moment for me here in Dombey and Son. And if you are really good at analyzing character and character relationships, but you're intimidated by the Victorian politics or historical context, this is another really good Charles Dickens to pick up, because it doesn't get into that in a really detailed manner where you're going to feel like you're dumb. You're not dumb. You're never dumb. And this book certainly doesn't make you feel that way. So I hope that I've convinced some of you to consider Dombey and Son. It's one of the big chunkers by Charles Dickens that no one really talks about and no one reads, but I am so glad that I read this because, I don't know if any other Dickens is going to be able to top this for me, and that's okay because this is a grand book to be at the top. Thank you so much for listening to me talk about Dombey and Son. Let me know in the comments down below what Charles Dickens books you have read and which ones you are most eager to get to. At the moment, I am reading/listening to Our Mutual Friend. I also have the David Timpson audiobook. Very excited. So I am for sure now actually participating in that Dickens Along hosted by Katie. Please check out all the links down below, and until next time, continue to be lovely and read some Dickens. And of course, thank you to my patrons. Your support makes it so that I can read big books like this and keep the channel going, and it's just awesome. So thank you very much. I hope you are having a wonderful day.